So good morning, everyone. I think we're at time. Very prompt return from coffee from everyone. My name is Dr. Alice Bunn. I'm International Director at the UK Space Agency. And I should start by saying it's an enormous privilege to be here to chair this session, which I'm sure will prove to be tremendously interesting with such an esteemed panel ahead of us. So this morning, I hope so far has caught your attention. I hope we're now convinced that, the security of space is an important issue. I'm sure many of you have had these discussions before. We're now going to move on to a session which really focuses on the threats and hazards to our space assets. Now, again, many of you in the room will have probably sat in such discussions. So how are we going to make this one different? Well, I think for a start, we're not only considering those technological threats and hazards, and we should be looking at this issue very much in the round. And I think these are points that are going to be drawn out by our speakers as we go on. Secondly, I think we need to reflect on how we communicate this to a wider audience. We are very expert at talking to each other. We are sometimes less expert at talking to government and indeed the public at large. So I would hope that we can also focus that in the discussion too. So broadly, as this morning, I think the event will be 3 talks. We're going to run them back to back. These will be on the record. You'll be able to refer to them after the event. But then we will have a discussion session that is very much off the record. So if I can at the outset encourage you to speak freely and openly and challenge the speakers as much as you feel comfortable to do. So without further ado, let's begin with Dr. Bleddyn Bowen from the University of Leicester.
Right. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Ali and the folk at RUSI for inviting me to speak here today. How do I advance these slides? I don't have a mouse or a keyboard. Good start. Oh, there it is. It was underneath the program. Excellent. Okay, yeah, so thanks very much for having me down here today. My name is Bleddyn Bowen. I'm a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester, and I specialise in space warfare, space power, and the international politics of space. And, of course, it's been a very busy year for us in the UK and the United States as well in terms of space politics and space policy and military space. Many of you are familiar with the so-called Space Force or the attempts to create a Space Corps in the United States, but of course in Britain and also Europe, Brexit has been dominating headlines, and of course Galileo has become a household name since the events of around this time last year. So today I'm just giving you some reflections on Brexit, space and UK space policy and the wider context in the current direction of travel in European astropolitics, based on my own research and also reflections on what's been happening since I published research on the issue. I'm not sure if these slides are going to be available or not after the event, but just show that there is reading material available that I have done on this topic and various other related topics as well. Question mark, has Britain been cast adrift of its own volition in space? And I would argue that in commercial, industrial and scientific terms, possibly, yes. Not so much in military and intelligence terms, but in the commercial and scientific and industrial uses of space, it is not really good news on the whole. And Britain is caught in a binary system, really, between the two giants of space power, one being the United States and the other one being the European Union / European Space Agency. I'll get into that EU-ESA relationship later on in the talk. But if we think of Europe as a whole as a giant of space power, which it arguably is, it has dominated British scientific and economic activity in space, arguably to the same degree that America dominates Britain's military and intelligence activities and dependencies on space as well. So Britain has had a feet on both sides of the Atlantic, and one side of that equation now is up in the air, really, or cast off into space, adrift, listless, because of the decision to leave the European Union and lack of serious planning beforehand on what Brexit meant for British space policy and strategy. So just a point of contrast there. So, Britain is heavily integrated in Europe for science and industry in space. And the EU has often not caught much attention in the space policy world because it's not seen as a state. Well, it isn't a state, but it is increasingly funneling more and more money into strategically relevant space programs and infrastructure, some of which are listed there. So the EU is a very active actor in space and increasingly playing a security and defense role and not just industrial integration and commercial exploitation. And these space capabilities are also foundational to wider common foreign policy goals that the European Union is keener to push. And the UK, of course, as a result of deciding to rescind its membership with the European Union, will no longer have the automatic access and privileges of those programs. And of course, what blew up in spring last year was Galileo. And the sort of hysteria that came out from the corridors of Whitehall about Britain being kicked out of the Galileo program is quite interesting, given that UK originally didn't want Galileo to happen in the first place. It very much tried to assist the United States in trying to prevent the emergence of Galileo, the Americans being afraid of a competitor to GPS and also providing a system that would not be compatible with the GPS's operating systems and signal frequencies. Since then, of course, UK-based companies have led on the payload development for the navigation system. So the actual navigation technology was made by British companies and finally then assembled in Germany by OHB, if I remember correctly, on the large satellites. China supported the EU in this dispute and agreed to convinced the United States to agree to a more multilateral way of resolving signal allocations and disputes for global navigation satellite systems. And this was all in around 2003 when that dispute was finally resolved. And of course, the European Union agreed to change some of the inner workings of Galileo so that it would not interfere with GPS, and in fact would actually become complementary and interoperable with GPS capabilities. And of course, in terms of the rhetoric in the media, it's important to remember that Galileo is a European and specifically an EU project, not a British one. Britain had a very important role in it, and much was made of the fact that around 15% of the work was made in the UK, but remember that means 85% of the work was not done in the UK. So just a bit of historical context there for anyone who's lucky enough to miss on the news last year and the drama that ensued. So Brexit and EU space policy. A lot of the dispute came down to the loss of UK-based industries' privileged access to developing the PRS signal, the Public Regulated Service Signal of Galileo. GNSS systems like GPS and Galileo have two different signal services. One is a highly encrypted, more secure signal that is used by military and intelligence agencies, which are very, very accurate. And the other is a commercially and civilian, publicly available signal, which is more susceptible to jamming, easier to spoof, and of course, freely available to everyone to use. PRS is Galileo's secure signal and very sensitive military-grade technology. And Britain was leading the technological development of that. But EU regulations and laws, which Britain helped develop and write, meant that only EU member states can have access to developing those technologies and only and to access the bidding contracts or the competitions to get the contracts. And of course, in the next round of Galileo acquisitions, the UK will no longer be able to do that. So that was one of the reasons why the drama happened last year, was because Britain was effectively being shut out of competing for those contracts. So non-EU members are barred from PRS contracts, or PRS-relevant contracts. For the less sensitive areas, other countries can participate, like Norway and Switzerland, which do have some minor contracts in Galileo development, but they are negotiated on a case-by-case basis. They're not automatically eligible for it. And there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system. It's quite an upset for the British military-industrial complex, and there's a lot of jobs involved in this as well. And the principle of industrial geo-return was seemingly lost on a lot of people, both within government and the media last year, that EU-funded space projects are going to go mostly to EU member states. If Britain does not want to be a member of the EU, it is no longer eligible for it. That simple fact was difficult to get across to a lot of people. And that's not an opinion on Brexit, it's just the reality of it. So there's a lot of misinformation from within government and media about all this, which helped complicate issues further. And if we can call it a response, really, because it's still Britain's own decision to leave the European Union and trigger Article 50, Britain floated the idea of building its own GNSS, the Galileo replacement Brexit system, which I have a favourite acronym for. And they also characterise it as a threat, that somehow Britain's own GNSS would be a threat to Galileo. And it's a significant opportunity cost for the British space industry and also for the British budget. It can't replicate Galileo. There were lots of promises, again, that this would be an easy thing to do. Where have you heard that one before? Replicating the technology from GNSS is simply not an option, partly for intellectual property reasons, but two, because you can't build the same system twice, otherwise the two systems will interfere with each other and they won't coexist. Different GNSS systems have to operate on different principles and different techniques in radio frequency communications and navigation. So GLONASS, Beidou, Galileo, GPS, they don't all operate in exactly the same way. Britain will have to develop yet another way of doing a GNSS. Some people even suggested that it could be done before Galileo was ready. Galileo was almost ready. We don't even have blueprints yet. So there's a lot of ridiculous statements coming out from all quarters about this last year. And as a consequence as well, the UK tried to hold up the ESA's Ministerial Council on procurement for Galileo, and that has arguably accelerated the European Union's attempts to set up a rival space agency within the EU or to assimilate ESA into its structures, remembering that the EU is ESA's single biggest contributor to the budget now. And most members of ESA are, of course, members of the European Union as well. Then in terms of the cost that the government brought out was £3 to £5 billion, which I'm not sure how they got to that. The so-called feasibility study, £92 million. Those are some expensive consultants. And, of course, to put it into context, just to show how much money we are talking about, the British gamble on small satellite launch capabilities, which may indeed actually happen, may actually be good, is about £50 million so far. So just to put that into context, there's a lot of money required to set up a GNSS, and it's a long decadal project as well that I don't think has been properly thought through. And importantly, it triplicates an expensive system. There is no capability added from a British GNSS system, unlike, say, Skynet, where real capability and value is added. From what we've seen from Galileo, there is nothing new being added because Britain will still be able to access PRS from Galileo. The European Union has said Britain, subject to negotiation, can still have Galileo in the MOD. And before all this happened, MOD was always going to have GPS as its primary GNSS provider. Now that has changed because of the political exigencies of Brexit. And of course, the European Union is thinking about autonomy, and nothing will get in the way of that. And Britain needs to recognise that. So it can't be an EU-UK project. So there's a few more slides there, but if they're going to be public, they're there for you to peruse in your own time. I have gotten far too excited about this and out of time, but happy to take more questions on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We've kicked off with a very, I think, looking quite specifically at navigation issues and through a political lens. So thank you very much, and we're going to take questions at the end of the session. So now, without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Beza Unal from Chatham House.
Thank you very much. Can I speak while sitting here? I'm not going to do a PowerPoint presentation. Thanks a lot for the opportunity for me to speak at this event. I'm going to go back to the first session and what we have kind of presented by our French colleagues and talk a little bit about what happens if we add the cyber element to the space and to the threats that we face today. But specifically, I'm going to talk about not space, but strategic systems that depend on space. What I realize is most of the time when we talk about space, we think about the space segment, but there is another element that comes with this, which is the military strategic systems that all function by using space data and space communications and technology. Now, what I realize with the research that we are doing at Chatham House, that we need to consider the operational and strategic, in a way, consequences of losing the space domain by cyber means. And if such thing happens, then what would be the outcome of that to the decision makers? There are, similar to our colleagues who represented in the beginning, there are 5 space capabilities that our research showed that are critical, especially for NATO and the key NATO countries. We haven't done a study in a way saying that the imaging, for instance, is more critical than the others, or the PNT is more critical than the others. The way that we look at the 5 capabilities that NATO uses on space is they are mostly interacting with each other. So we can't say that communications aspect is less important than the PNT aspect, for instance. I'll go through these 5 capabilities in a very short time. The first capability is the position, navigation, time, and velocity capability. This is the PNT part of it that was in the discussion. We use PNT mainly for conducting timely and effective operations, and that the loss of PNT would also actually jeopardize the whole mission or the operation itself. Saying that, of course, for instance, if you look at Afghanistan, there were occasions that the troops could not reach to the GPS signals. But if you look at the numbers, in 2004, for instance, in Iraq, 68% of the munitions were guided through space means. If you look at Afghanistan, again, the United States used 60% of the missiles and the torpedoes that were used are precision-guided munitions. That means that there is high vulnerability in the operations that we rely on today to space systems. The second capability is the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability, which is presented as at the beginning as the imaging, I think, capability. This is the one where you receive satellite imagery, situational awareness, and so on. The problem, if a cyber attack happens to an ISR capability, the problem would be, let's say, spoofing, right? Consider that a flux of information, spoofed information, feeds into the system, and then the intelligence officer is looking at the information that he's getting, and there is this kind of clash of information. How can he actually analyze and assess that in a timely manner? That is the main problem that we face today for the military and for the decision makers. The third capability, which is again raised as the ballistic missile one, is the threat warning and threat assessment capability. This is called the ITWTA capability by the United States. It is the capability that where we actually detect ballistic missile launch situations. This capability is used both in peacetime. For instance, any kind of missile attack that happens in Yemen or any other places, we could assess that, but also in conflict time as well. And that the threat warning and threat assessment capability also allows us to kind of integrate the missile defense system, and how can we think about the missile defense system that we rely, for instance, in Poland, in Romania, or in Iron Dome for Israel, and so on. If the control system of a missile defense system, let's say Iron Dome, is interfered by cyber means, then I could think of at least two scenarios that we need to consider what could happen. The first scenario is that the missile defense system would not be able to detect an upcoming missile, right? And this may actually put the whole population in danger. The second scenario would be the system may be falsely activated to respond to what it believes to be a missile, an upcoming missile, and it would, for instance, project the trajectory of that upcoming missile, this decoy missile, based on the speeds, based on the velocity, and so on. And it would try to shoot down that missile, right, by intercepting it. And at the result, what it would shoot probably is nothing. So you would end up having a first strike scenario where you may end up hitting the civilians, where you might end up hitting the critical national infrastructure of the other country, and so on. For the sake, think this in a conflict situation or in a situation where everything is tense, you may end up having an escalatory case. And that is where I think we need to think again of what these capabilities mean to us and how can we prevent the vulnerability to cyber attacks to these capabilities. The fourth is the communications part of it. Communications is extremely important for command and control. You can't rely on, the communication systems is providing us the main information that goes to the decision maker. It could be the prime minister, it could be the president who is going to give that decision. It comes through the communication. And the fifth one, the last one, is the environmental monitoring. And I'm not going to talk much about that, but the environmental monitoring capability gives us mission planning. It gives us the flight trajectory targeting, and so on. Now, why should we be concerned about losing these 5 capabilities by cyber threats? First of all, these capabilities have dual use purposes. Some of them are used both in the civilian space and also in the military space. And some of them are actually used both in the conventional missions and also in the nuclear missions. So there is kind of like this entanglement, especially if you look at the ballistic missile systems or the ISR, they are used both in the nuclear and the conventional side of it. That entanglement actually tips the idea of deterrence that we rely on today. How would, for instance, NATO respond to an attack to a weather satellite, right? That could be actually providing civilian asset, or it could be actually providing an asset to the military system, or it could be used by nuclear-tipped submarines. How would NATO know that what type of an attack that it faces, or whether that attack was to only a civilian asset when it uses for both missions? And how would we put this in an Article 5 situation, for instance? The answer is still not there. We don't know the answer, so that's why I'm asking the questions as well. The second concern that we have in this regard is that all these 5 space capabilities are complex and tightly coupled systems. Nuclear power plants, for instance, are also tightly coupled systems. Now, complex systems often function as they are intended to under normal conditions. But when they are under stress, for instance, through cyber means, they may respond differently. The way to understand whether they would respond differently in certain situations is you can do some testing, some simulations, and so on in peacetime situations. But yet, you would still would not get the whole range of consequences of a possible cyber attack happening to one of the space assets, the capabilities, or simultaneous to all, or so on. Thus, I think we need to study that complex networks and how much of an interdependency exists between these 5 categories. That takes me to my last point on on these 5 capabilities that we rely on. They are interlinked with each other. And all these 5 capabilities actually make a military operation successful. If you think about, for instance, and this is something that Ellie mentioned last week in one of our events, if you think about like a drone strike scenario, you would need not only one PNT capability, you would also need different capabilities that we rely today on space that I mentioned as well. So this takes us to a level of intersection of capabilities where the vulnerabilities probably would not rely only on the PNT system or only on the communication system, but the intersection of the whole. In conclusion, I think losing space technology and data, especially in times of conflict, may have paramount consequences to the success of an operation. And that the decision makers and the commanders should incorporate that into their operational planning way before than what could happen during the conflict. And we could provide some solutions on this issue as well, but I think I already talked 10 minutes, so I'll just stop here.
Super. Beza, thank you very much indeed. I think we've already started turning the dial, as it were, away from a more political perspective to more looking at our dependencies and critically our vulnerabilities. And I'm sure it's provoked already some very interesting questions from the audience. But before we get there, I'd suggest we move straight over to our last but not least final speaker, Dr. Stuart Eaves, who is a space consultant. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Alice. Good morning. I was asked to look at some of the hazards, the untargeted threats that our space systems face. In particular, I'm going to talk about space debris and solar activity, and I'd like to thank Lord Harris and our friends from the École de Guerre for introducing these topics. I hope I'm going to be able to take you perhaps one level of granularity further down. So one of the prime issues that we have with the sun is that we don't fully understand it. There are different types of solar activity, solar flares and coronal mass ejections, all have the potential to generate effects on satellites, and some, in particular the coronal mass ejections, have the ability to generate effects in the atmosphere and on the ground, as Lord Harris mentioned. And we experience low levels of effect all the time. As the solar activity varies, it tends to pump up and down the upper layers of the Earth's atmosphere, causing variable amounts of drag on our satellite orbits. And that's one of the reasons why, in order to do a better job of forward prediction of our satellite orbits and to do a better job of conjunction analysis, we need to understand the sun better, such that we can forecast its activity rather than simply measure what it's just done. And that's one of the reasons why it was encouraging to see the creation of the Space Weather Centre as part of the Met Office, that we're actually now starting to try and look to the future in this case. So the particular interference that you could get, as I mentioned, satellites can be temporarily disrupted, and that can come from essentially two different sources. You can have single event upsets caused by the shock front that arrives in a major solar event. That may cause a satellite to either temporarily or permanently go offline. But there's also the sort of longer duration total dose effects. If the sun pumps a lot of energy into the Earth's electromagnetic environment, the particles that are trapped in the Van Allen radiation belts will eventually find their way onto spacecraft and shorten their lifetimes. And some of the satellites that are already close to the end of their lifetimes may be pushed over the edge by a major event. The atmosphere can be significantly disturbed. You get extreme auroral displays when you get a major solar event. And the illustration that I've got at the bottom of the screen here is from the 13th of March 1989. It's an artist's impression of the North American continent, and you'll notice that the lights are missing in the northeast corner around the Great Lakes. The reason being that there was a major current induced in one of the cables carrying power down from the hydroelectric plants in Canada. on which a lot of northeast Canada and some of New York State were dependent. And when those transformers blew, a whole lot of lights went out. So if you were in a region affected by a major power outage, potentially your satellite ground station has no power. And again, as was mentioned, if you haven't got adequate backup generators, even if your satellite's working and even if the atmosphere is allowing signals through, potentially the ground station may not be listening or talking anymore. If you're in any doubt about the level of threat that we face, I was able to liberate this slide from a lady called Ruth Bamford, who's a plasma physics expert at Rutherford Appleton Laboratory. The timeline along the bottom is the Apollo years from 1968 to 72. The blue lines are the dates of the Apollo missions. On the y-axis is various radiation doses going up to the fatal line, the red line, and you'll notice that between Apollos 16 and 17, there was a solar proton event which, had there been astronauts on their way to or from the moon at that time, would have killed them. Basically, the Apollo modules didn't provide enough radiation shielding for that level of event. And it's quite a sobering thought. There was some understanding of the risks that were being run, but because of this lack of forecasting capability, there was no guarantee that you would be able to avoid an event like that. So I don't know if you still want to be an astronaut, having seen that slide. It's put me off, I can tell you. Lord Harris mentioned the Carrington event. The auroral displays that he mentioned were so bright that the Boston newspaper the following day made the point that you could actually read the newspaper at night by the light of the aurora, which is, that's a bright aurora. Since we've discussed that already, I will move on because it occurred to me some time ago, is the Carrington event the worst that the sun can do? And I'm fortunate enough to know a gentleman called Clive Dyer, who was the head of the space radiation team at Farnborough for many years. And he said to me, have you come across the year 774? And I had to say, no, I hadn't. But disappointingly, the answer to the question, is Carrington the worst that the sun can do, appears to be no. So if Lord Harris depressed you, I'm going to depress you further still, I'm afraid. So in 774, there was a major solar event. How do we know? Because clearly there weren't scientists like Richard Carrington observing the sun back then. So what we've done is looked at dendrochronology, tree ring data, and ice cores. And in both cases, there is a spike in 774 corresponding to the creation of novel isotopes at the top of the atmosphere, corresponding to a major amount of energy being dumped into the Earth's electromagnetic system. Interestingly, in that year, there are references in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles to a thing that they called a red crucifix. As a scientist, I never thought I would be quoting the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles to an audience like this, but it's widely interpreted that this is people at lower latitudes seeing a major aurora. If you know anything about auroras, the green ones are the sort of mild ones and the red ones are the exciting ones. They were seeing a major auroral display at low latitudes associated with this event. And it's thought that that event could be as much as 10 times Carrington. So if you thought Carrington was bad, we probably have to put some margins into the protections that we put into our systems. So what can we do about it? Well, the answer potentially is a monitoring network. The Lagrange points are obvious places to choose. They are gravitationally stable points in the Earth-Sun system. And the point on the line between the Earth and the Sun, L1, is a good place to actually measure the magnetic polarity of the plasma that's heading towards the Earth. If it is co-aligned, then potentially it's a bit like trying to push two magnets together where you're trying to push the north poles together. They don't want to do it. If they are cross-aligned, it's a similar situation with the magnets. They will join together very readily, so you'll get a lot more energy dumped into the Earth's system. There's quite a debate about where it might be better to put another monitoring spacecraft so that you can actually watch the material heading towards the Earth, whether L4 or L5 would be the best. Some people reckon that L5 is the best because if you're not aware, look down from the North Pole of the sun's rotating anti-clockwise in a little less than a month. It turns through about 15 degrees a day. So if you go to the L5 position, which is 60 degrees behind the Earth on its orbit, you'll get roughly another 4 days of advance warning that you can do forecasting with. But interestingly, an L4 position is perhaps better for actually measuring the events that could actually affect the Earth. So these are further slides from one of Ruth's presentations. The locations marked on the lower illustration here are the sites at which an eruption occurred that subsequently affected the Earth. And you'll notice they're all roughly on the right-hand side of the solar disk. The reason being that because of that solar rotation, the field lines get curved, and some of the events that can affect the Earth can actually occur over the limb of the sun from the point of view of us, but would be in view of L4, so that we wouldn't be taken by surprise by an eruption that we can't actually see from the ground. Turning to space debris, well, we didn't start off very well. This is Anatoly Zak's illustration of the Sputnik launch. You'll notice one operational satellite, 2 pieces of space debris, so it wasn't a good ratio to start off with. After about 2 weeks, Sputnik stopped transmitting because its batteries died. And then we had 3 pieces of space debris. It's got quite a lot worse. And as was pointed out earlier, stuff in low Earth orbit is traveling very fast. So even something the size of a sugar cube has the equivalent energy of a hand grenade, which is going to make for a bad day if it meets your satellite. Just to illustrate the problem, this is part of the solar arrays from the International Space Station, and an object about that size just went straight through. So we have an issue with the growth of debris over time. We saw this graph earlier, so I won't belabor this point, but we have this convention that we're trying to get stuff out of orbit in 25 years. Is that long enough? This is a plot of where that debris is in terms of altitude in low Earth orbit. You'll notice the peaks corresponding to a couple of the major events that were measured earlier. I had the opportunity to speak to the system engineer for the OneWeb constellation a couple of years ago. I asked him why he'd chosen 1,200 kilometers as the altitude for that system. He said, because it's a local minimum in the debris population. So the debris population is actually now driving decisions from commercial companies on where to put their satellites. So these are some of the projections. We had a somewhat similar graph from our French colleagues earlier. One of the things I would point out is the oscillations on the future projections of the debris population, depending on how well we do in terms of post-mission disposal. Those oscillations are the 11-year solar cycle. It's assumed that every 11 years the sun gets more active and creates more drag, which causes some of the debris population to re-enter and burn up. That'll work well as long as the sun continues to do an 11-year cycle, but there have been periods at the end of the 1600s, for example, where the sun didn't appear to generate many sunspots for a period of about 60 years. If it goes quiescent again, we can't rely on the little downward parts of those graphs, and the population increases even faster. There are lots of ways of trying to get debris out of orbit. If you think this is a busy slide, it's quite deliberately so. Every time I hear about a new method of getting debris out of orbit, I try and add it to the slide. And that just sort of emphasizes that no one debris removal technology is really hacking it for all the different types of debris that we have. Some of it is large rocket bodies and big defunct satellites. Some of it is much, much smaller stuff, some of which we struggle even to track. And there's issues to do with the extent to which all of these technologies in the wrong hands start to look like military weapons. You know you've got a problem when Scott Adams writes a Dilbert cartoon about the problem that you're dealing with. So to conclude, there is the concept in our world of a perfect storm. So a major solar eruption occurs, various satellites experience anomalies and some failed, but some are potentially just in safe mode and in need of some care and attention. However, some of the ground stations have lost power. Communications to all satellites are potentially affected by ionospheric scintillation, so it's hard to send the commands required to get your satellite back online. All the objects in low Earth orbit in particular have their orbits perturbed by increasing atmospheric drag. So there's an increased risk of collision due to tracking uncertainties. The debris starts to become more of a problem. Unfortunately, just at that point when you need them most, the radars are struggling to do accurate tracking because, again, the ionosphere is causing problems for their signals. You might think that you could rely to some extent on optical tracking to take up the slack, but if you've got an awful lot of bright lights flashing around in the sky due to auroras, then that's not going to be easy either. So some of the 6 satellites are going to be lost to communications delays. If you can't talk to them in time, they will die despite levels of autonomy that are built in. And unfortunately, we end up in a situation where society is affected for decades. So thank you very much.